Before I introduce our next lecturer, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this conference. Your generosity has enabled us to welcome speakers from both sides of the Atlantic, visit 2 world-class museums, and enjoy the company of our fellow attendees. Thank you for leading from the front in support of the International Churchill Society. Our next lecturer is a great friend to the International Churchill Society. Katherine Carter has assisted the Society for many years and served as co-host of last year's conference in London. Many of you here tonight have probably also seen Katherine at Chartwell, the Churchill's family home, where she serves as the property's curator and has managed the house and collection there for almost a decade. Katherine and her husband Ian are the only couple, other than Winston and Clementine Churchill, to have been married in the Church of St. Margaret's, Westminster, and to have lived in Chartwell, the attic of which was the first place they called home. Katherine's forthcoming book, Churchill, Chartwell, and the Countdown to War, will appear in 2024. Today, she will be lecturing on Cherub or Bulldog, Churchill's portraits in War and Peace. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Katherine Carter.
Thank you so much, Candice, for that wonderful introduction. As curator of the Churchill's home at Chartwell, I have the great pleasure of managing an astonishing collection of artworks, including a number of portraits of Sir Winston Churchill. Today, I'm going to show you, using pictures from our collection at Chartwell, why, probably more so than any other historical figure of the 21st century, Winston Churchill had an intuitive understanding of the power of portraiture due to 3 distinct facets of his life and career. First, as a political personality, he knew not only the benefits to electoral success of image, but even more importantly than this, image recognition. This is something that Churchill cultivated from the earliest years of his political career, which he did to such effect that he is one of the few individuals in history who can be recognized today by a mere silhouette. Secondly, as a historian, he knew the power of visual sources to influence future historical analysis, and in turn, the curation of one's legacy. Which images of him would be the ones that would leap to mind when future generations were considering his achievements? And lastly, as an artist, he had a keen interest in the process of creating art and the importance of the artist-sitter relationship, and what an artist needs to deliver the best possible portrait of an individual. But perhaps before that, one quick question. How does one define a good portrait? So firstly, and probably quite obviously, the artist's mission is to create an accurate image of that person. This is an absolute must. They must be instantly recognizable. Otherwise, it's fallen at the first hurdle. For it to be a great portrait, it has to feel like them. It has to somehow capture their personality and their spirit, and it should feel almost like they're in the room with you. The difficulty we face today when considering portraits of Churchill, or any iconic figure from history, is that we all have a preconceived idea of what they were like. From the 20th century onwards, this became an even greater challenge for portrait painters, because their sitters were more visible to potential viewers of their artwork through photographs and film. The portrait painter also has to deal with the fact that they are seeing an everyday version of the sitter, and the pleasantries of a sitting can dilute the impact of an individual. It would be a lot to ask for Winston Churchill during this sitting for the artist Douglas Chandor to be channeling greatness every single moment they were sat there. Consequently, what an artist sees might not necessarily align with public image, and what we as the viewer think should be portrayed in order to be an accurate depiction. So as I said, he couldn't have channeled greatness in every moment in front of an artist. He couldn't therefore channel courage, tenacity, determination, defiance in every moment. He was a complex character, like all of us, and had an entire spectrum of emotions and demeanors. So if a portrait artist accurately portrays the person in front of them, but it doesn't coalesce with our image or persona, can it still be considered a great portrait? If a portrait of Churchill depicts strength, he's the Bulldog, and otherwise he's the Cherub. And Churchill knew this, as illustrated by this ask that he made of the artist Graham Sutherland at the outset of his sittings for his 80th birthday portrait. By looking at Churchill as a political figure, as a historian, and as an artist, we can use these prisms to re-evaluate depictions of him on canvas, as well as his own complex relationship with how he was depicted on canvas. So let's look at the political purpose first of all. Winston Churchill's long political career began in 1900 when he was elected as a Member of Parliament for the constituency of Oldham. He had high name recognition at this point, being a successful writer and journalist, but his image recognition was still fledgling. He had long held out the hope of entering Parliament alongside his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, seen here, who had served as Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second highest role in British politics, at the height of his career. After Lord Randolph's premature death, aged just 45, Churchill said, "All my dreams of companionship with him, of entering Parliament at his side and in his support, were ended. There remained only for me to pursue his aims and vindicate his memory." Beyond these stated ambitions, however, was Churchill's desire to enter Parliament, initially at least, in his father's image. In one of the earliest portraits Churchill commissioned of himself after his first election, in the summer of 1901, Churchill procured the services of the portrait artist Edwin Ward, who had previously painted this portrait of his father. The commission made by Churchill in 1901 was for a replica of the portrait of Lord Randolph Churchill. That is the explicit wording in the letter. But this time, he would transpose himself into the negative space left by his father's premature death. The portrait of Randolph, which hung on the south wall of Churchill's study during his lifetime and still does to this day, is a formal composition. We can see it's viewed side on. He has a very stiff posture, and he's writing his budget notes, which feature as modern-day symbolism of political power and influence. Note the apparel. He's in a three-piece black suit and tie. Note the furnishings, the ornate chair with the Prince of Wales feather on them, the decorative brass item on the desk, for example. And then have a look at the picture that Churchill commissioned of himself. This is 1 year into his political career, and the overt and intentional similarities are immediately apparent. This is painted with the clear intention of showing Churchill as someone who is following in his father's footsteps. If you look closely, however, you can start to see a number of differences. Churchill is a man of words, for example, not numbers, like his father. And while Randolph is undertaking numerical analysis, Winston appears to be writing a letter, and his posture denotes proximity and closeness to his work. The writing apparatus has changed. Randolph's writing with a quill in the 1880s, whereas Winston has a pen, denoting modernity. And overall, there is an energy and a warmth to the depiction of Churchill that is lacking in that of his father. So the intention is to mirror. That's what the commission was to do. But the artist is responding to the character of the sitter, as shown over a lengthy period of time together during the sittings. This is likely why the traits of formality and severity, which are so apparent in Randolph's portrait, are softened in the Winston one, even though the wording of the commission was to replicate, because his character was inherently different from that of his father, and that is what the artist saw. even when there was no longer a need to position himself as Randolph Churchill's son, his lifelong desire to impress his father can be seen in the work of one of the greatest portrait artists of his time, John Singer Sargent. This charcoal portrait, undertaken in 1925, was one of Sargent's last ever works and was commissioned by Churchill's friend Philip Sassoon to depict Churchill in the role he had coveted for so long, Chancellor of the Exchequer. And in fact, they are his father's Chancellor robes that he exclaimed with delight that he still had in his possession when he was offered the role, and then had this portrait done wearing them. Churchill had long been an admirer of Sargent's art. By this time, Churchill's been painting for almost a decade, and one of the means by which he has intended to improve his own skill is by copying other artists, just to mirror their techniques, to get under the skin of how it is that they create art. And one of the ones that he went to most often for this purpose was Sargent. Furthermore, Sargent had previously done a portrait of Jenny Churchill, the beautiful and vibrant mother of Winston. Sassoon had seen the picture of Jenny hanging on the wall at Chartwell and knew how much it meant to Churchill, who had lost his mother just 4 years before the charcoal portrait of him. Both pictures hang on the walls of Chartwell today, and the Winston one I know to be particularly admired by modern artists because of the determination of his expression, which isn't always captured in depictions of him. Churchill, however, wasn't without criticism of this charcoal portrait. In a letter to his son, Churchill wrote, "Philip came here last night and fell into raptures over the Sargent drawing. I was hard put to it to reconcile truth and politeness. I wanted to point out the awful concavity of my right cheek. However, one must not look a gift portrait in the mouth." These two portraits of Winston Churchill, done by Edwin Ward and done by Singer Sargent, were commissioned to reinforce Churchill's political status, either as a newly elected Member of Parliament or as one of the most senior ministers in the British government. Here we have a colorized photograph from the late 1930s of Winston Churchill in his study at Chartwell. Now, this room is one that features heavily in the book that I'm writing, which Candice kindly mentioned, with the working title of Churchill, Chartwell, and the Countdown to War. And my thesis is that by charting the meetings that take place at Chartwell during the 1930s, you can see conversations happening there that ultimately shape his stance in terms of sounding the alarm against Germany in the 30s, but also his wartime leadership. So the people who are coming into this room are the people he is either trying to influence and persuade, or those he's trying to gather information from. And so by putting these two pictures here, he is immediately showing his own seniority in British politics, but also creating a sense of dynasty. But neither of the moments of the Sargent portrait or the Ward portrait were in Churchill's mind the peak of his career. He had a sense that they weren't the moments that were going to secure his place in history. This is a man, after all, who in 1891 remarked to a fellow pupil at Harrow, "This country will be subjected somehow to a tremendous invasion. By what means I do not know, but I tell you, I shall be in command of the defense of London, and I shall save London and England from disaster." His sense of destiny was intertwined with his sense of history. And with this, how does the portraiture from when he had reached that moment in his career, when holding the office of Prime Minister in the Second World War, convey the man that was Winston Churchill? Since he knew that that period of his life would make history, or at least had a strong belief that it would, and be reflected on for generations to come. These two portraits are thought to be the only ones formally commissioned of Winston Churchill during the Second World War, by which I mean there were ones where there were sittings or otherwise authorized access to Churchill himself in order to gain a true likeness. The one on the left hangs at Chartwell and was based on drawings over a longer period of time, but from a distance. So Salisbury's been given access to the press gallery in Commons, and he's drawing sketches over a number of days and weeks. It was commissioned by the Devonshire Club, a members' club on St. James's Square in London, which has since merged with the East India Club, for anyone who knows St. James's, and that's where you can find an identical portrait to this one. Churchill, knowing of the commission, then asked if an identical copy could be made for him to have in his personal possession, and that copy is the one that hangs in the library at Chartwell. The one on the right is in a private collection that was recently shown at the Churchill War Rooms in London. Unlike the Chartwell portrait, it was the result of a single sitting of just 1 hour with the Prime Minister. As you can see, the result, even though undertaken at a similar time and by the same artist, are two very different paintings. The one on the right has an energy to it, resulting from the rapidity of its creation, and a likely sense of urgency from Churchill himself, who didn't have much time to spare for sittings at that point in the war. The brushwork on this painting is much freer, and there's a strength and a determination to it. It has impact as an image. We, as the viewer, might arguably connect more to the image on the right as wartime leader for this reason, because it depicts what we hope to see in a likeness of him on canvas at that time. By contrast, the Chartwell portrait on the left, the result of extended but indirect access over the course of the winter of 1942 to 1943, because it was over a longer period of time, has much more detail to it. It lacks the immediacy of the one on the right and conveys a more complex image of Winston Churchill. In the Chartwell portrait on the left, he looks directly out of the canvas at the viewer. We are interrupting him. He's clearly immersed in his work. He's got his papers. He's removed his glasses, which he's holding in one hand, and he maintains our gaze as the viewer. It feels more like a private moment that we have interrupted, and his facial expression conveys that. Here we see neither the Cherub nor the Bulldog, you could argue. There's neither ferocity nor playfulness to this image. In my mind, it's a very honest portrayal of Winston Churchill, because you can see the weight of what is on his shoulders. You can see the tiredness, and you can see the strain. He's not performing. He's not summoning strength in that moment. You've caught him off guard. And so to me, it is a truer depiction of the man known to have keenly felt the impact of frustrations and hardships over his long political career. And I think it's telling that of these two portraits, it was the one on the left that Winston wanted the copy of for his home. It is perhaps worth adding that the Salisbury portrait at Chartwell was the one chosen above any other image of him to feature in the publicity for Chartwell's opening in 1966. As an additional feature, I really like the frame of this painting. So what is rather unusual is the artist has chosen an early modern Spanish-style frame, which they are being used this time, but they're comparatively rare. In my mind, I like to think the selection of that frame was because what other historical event where there had been an attempted invasion of British shores that ultimately failed? Spanish Armada. Perhaps that was inspiration from this choice. Perhaps Churchill knew this reference, perhaps he might not have done, but I love that it's weaving in previous military victories at a moment in the war when any strength and support and moral conviction could be summoned to aid Winston Churchill's leadership at that point. So we've considered Churchill's relationship with portraiture as a political figure and as a historian, but what about as an amateur artist? In the studio at Chartwell hangs the only self-portrait that Churchill ever painted. There are other paintings where he's included himself in the composition when recreating a photograph or depicting a landscape, but this is the only portrait he did of himself. Now, it's one where I have had countless debates and discussions about this painting during my decade of managing the collection at Chartwell. It's painted in the aftermath of the Dardanelles disaster, a military campaign which resulted in significant casualties and for which Churchill was largely seen as responsible by many at the time. And it depicts him at a time when his wife Clementine said, "I thought he would die of grief," and which Churchill later reflected as being when the muse of painting came to my rescue. This painting is one of Churchill's earliest and was not intended for any sort of public consumption at the time. And there are those who look at this painting, knowing of that historical context, and see its darkness as a depiction of his purported depression on canvas. Now, in my mind, it's too easy to adopt that position of, dare I say it, amateur psychologist in relation to this painting. Art is, of course, subjective, and Churchill never wrote of his precise thinking in the creation of this particular composition. But for me, there is strong evidence to inform a more pragmatic approach to interpreting this painting. This approach of mine is informed by another portrait of Churchill created around this time by the person who provided almost the entirety of Churchill's artistic mentorship in the aftermath of the First World War, Sir John Lavery. This portrait of Churchill hangs on the main stairs of Chartwell and is typical of what Lavery is doing in portraits at this time. You have a very brightly lit central figure surrounded by a dark surround. It was commissioned by the Armoured Car Squadron and was the result of numerous in-person sittings of Churchill in his First World War uniform, but contrasted with his rather distinctive poilu helmet. It, like Churchill's self-portrait, has the very reduced palette, and the result is a striking image. It's an effect that Churchill saw across another portrait, which hangs at Chartwell. So this one is done of his wife at a very, very similar time, as a companion portrait to the one of Churchill. Now, with artists, there is very often a thread you can follow as to who is influencing who. Carry on down this line, who is Lavery influenced by? John Singer Sargent, the charcoals of whom we saw earlier. And his portraits, similarly, reduced palette, dark surround, brightly lit central figure. Now, in turn, Singer Sargent spent time studying at the Prado, where he said his main influence was Diego Velázquez. Again, you can see the same reduced palette, brightly lit central figure, and dark surround. Throughout Churchill's joyride in a paint box, as he called it, he was like a sponge, absorbing the styles and techniques of those influencing him at the time. As part of a current series that I'm filming for the BBC at the moment, about the work that I and curators at other National Trust houses do to care for our collections, I've been fortunate enough to spend time with the grandson of Ernest Townsend, who painted a portrait of Churchill in 1915, which hangs today in the Liberal Club in London. Townsend's grandson, as part of the discussion piece for the cameras, delighted in telling me how interested his grandfather was in politics. But Churchill wouldn't let him get a word in edgeways, because Churchill was too busy discussing and learning about painting techniques. As Churchill's influence broadened and time passed, the colours in his own paintings lighten. You don't tend to see this dark palette really beyond around 1920. And his attention moves away from portraiture towards depicting light and shade and colour and reflection, usually across the natural landscape. But at the time of his self-portrait, when his entire frame of reference for how to paint is the mentorship of Sir John Lavery, I'm afraid it is for that reason that I, perhaps controversially, am less inclined to impose a psychological analysis onto the creation of Winston Churchill's self-portrait. Now, that's not to say Churchill didn't suffer from and endure hardships, frustrations, pressure, strain over the course of his long career. But I simply don't think that can necessarily be applied to this portrait. So from those pictures I've showed you so far, they've largely been ones from times of war. How about from times when he was less in the public spotlight? Here we have a double portrait of Winston Churchill and his beloved wife Clementine, commissioned for their silver wedding anniversary. It hangs at Chartwell, and it is depicting a scene at Chartwell. They are both having breakfast together in the dining room. Now, truth be told, it's a largely hypothetical scene. The Churchills rarely breakfasted together. But not only that, it's a rather strange depiction if you look closely. So, for example, you might see that Winston Churchill's chair appears to be levitating. There are no legs to the chair. He also doesn't have a face, something of a hurdle in terms of a portrait. The reason for this is that Nicholson presented his final copy to the Churchills for their silver wedding anniversary and asked to borrow it back for an exhibition. decided that there was a few things he wanted to tweak. It just wasn't quite right. And in doing so, somehow managed to completely ruin the painting. And decided, I can imagine rather meekly, to give back this earlier study as what would go back. I would love to have been a fly on the wall for how that conversation went. What I love about this painting, though, is the atmosphere that Nicholson has chosen to recreate. Nicholson became a close friend to the Churchills. He appears in Chartwell's visitors book many times. And as a regular visitor to Chartwell, he had a longer period of time to absorb that sense of who Winston Churchill was, and who he was particularly when spending time together at his home and with his family. The overall scene is one of informality and serenity. You might see that Clementine is feeding a cat some cream on the table. Not only that, look at the curtain on the right. You can see a chicken's just wandered in from the garden through the open door. Absolutely brilliant. So, I should say, there is one final pictorial representation of Churchill beyond this lovely idyllic scene of him and his wife at his home that I would like to spotlight for you all today. It's not only my favourite picture of Churchill, it is my favourite object in the entire collection at Chartwell. Now, I'm cheating somewhat from my original brief because this is a group portrait and it's a print on paper. The original which is 12 foot tall, which handily, because of the size of the screen, you could actually see in its almost accurate dimensions. Although I should say that this is the print copy that hangs in Churchill's bedroom. The original group portrait is an oil-on-canvas painting, which hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It depicts 17 individuals, all men, recreating a hypothetical scene, because these 17 men were never actually in the same room at the same time. But the symbolism tells us it's loosely set around the time of the Treaty of Versailles. So, for example, the winged figure looming over the scene, that's the Victory of Samothrace, which is displayed in the Louvre in Paris. Of those featured, Winston Churchill is arguably the most junior in the scene. So here's the portrait gallery version, just because I think it's probably slightly easier to see. So other sitters include, I'll get on one slide, Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister of Australia, who you can see resting his head on his hand. David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who sits one seat along. William Massey, Prime Minister of New Zealand, can be seen seated but facing away. And Sir Robert Borden, Prime Minister of Canada, stands towards the back of the composition. And I could go on. So keep in mind that at this point, Churchill is probably the most junior player in this entire scene. He's really only just made the cut to feature in it, having been First Lord of the Admiralty at the outset of the war, and then Ministry of Munitions towards the end of the war. So with Winston Churchill being hugely eclipsed in terms of political authority of those in this painting, there are three remarkable things about how he's depicted. Firstly, he is in the absolute middle of this painting. Like I said, this doesn't really make any sense given his level of seniority at this point in time. The individual sittings for each of the featured individuals were done between 1919 and 1921, and the composition was set in 1922, a year when Churchill, in his own words, found himself without a party, without an office, and without an appendix. Not a great year for Winston. So why is he there? Why is he in the absolute middle? Not only that, and just to point him out, he is the one who you can see head on hand with the bow tie in the middle. He is also the only one looking directly out of the canvas. That's a really remarkable decision for Sir James Guthrie to have made, to choose him above all other sitters, for us, the viewer, to be meeting his eye. And lastly, and I hope you can all see this, he's bathed in a sort of heavenly swathe of light from the top right of the composition. So like I said, there's no obvious reason why Churchill is portrayed in this way. He's at low point of his political career, still rebuilding his reputation after the Dardanelles campaign, and it is only with hindsight that we all know the political ascendancy that awaited him. Perhaps our thanks should be to the artist, who had extended periods of time with his sitter and must have seen something in Winston Churchill that informed his decision-making about the composition of this group portrait. In turn, Churchill's ownership of the print copy of it is evidence of his deep appreciation of the painting and how he is depicted in it. Somehow both Cherub and Bulldog in one. But it also says a lot about Winston Churchill himself and how he wanted others to see him, and his own sense of destiny, and his understanding of the importance of history, and his own belief in the greatness that awaited him. All of these things are encapsulated in how he is displayed in this one picture, which we know was not only at his home during his lifetime, but hung on his bedroom wall, making it one of the first things he saw every morning and one of the last things he saw each night. In my opinion, you can learn more about Winston Churchill and his ambitions and his self-belief from this one group portrait, from him buying a print of it and from him hanging it in his most personal, private space at his home, than virtually any other object in existence. Winston Churchill understood the power of portraiture, in part because of his own growing interest in art and in painting, but even more so because of his intuitive sense of the importance of image and image recognition. And this meant that he saw portraits as a powerful tool which could shape contemporary political perceptions and in due course inform future interpretations of his life and legacy, just as I have thoroughly enjoyed doing for you all today. Thank you very much.
We would welcome any questions.
Where's Edwina? I can't see her. Ah, fabulous. Thank you, Edwina.
How does the same care and concern apply to the photography done of him that he does with the portraits, and how does that work?
So with most photographs of Winston Churchill, they're not necessarily posed for. They are either reportage or family moments or whatever it may be. The one that leaps to mind as being, in my mind, as good a portrayal of him as any portrait is, of course, the Karsh photo portrait, where the genius, as opposed to what all of these individuals are doing with a paintbrush, is, in his case, just a click of a camera. But there's something about that moment. Karsh knew the exact microsecond of when his eyes had closed in just that right way, and that is pure Bulldog. And my argument for today is that Winston Churchill particularly appreciated the depictions of him where he could put them in one of those two camps. And I would say that the Karsh one, possibly even more so than any painting, is pure Bulldog.
Did you mention when he acquired this print, was it before the war or after the war?
Sorry, what was that? Which was what before or after the war?
When did he acquire that print? Was it before the war or after the war?
Perfect. So he acquired that in the interwar years, so it was in the 1930s. So the painting, it's listed as being 1919 to 1930. So as I said, sittings were done up until 21, composition set 22. James Guthrie then fell really quite ill. That's part of the reason it took so long. And so 1930 was when it was finished and given to the National Portrait Gallery immediately for public display. And it was at that point that prints were made, and he bought one straight away in 1930. So yes, when Prime Ministership was definitely a long way down the road at that point, and you can imagine him just looking at it every morning and thinking, I'll get there. Yeah.
Yes, I've got a question. Graham Sutherland was commissioned to paint a portrait of Winston Churchill back in 1954, and it's alleged that he burned it because it was unflattering. A lot of these portraits here aren't that flattering either. So I'm wondering why he pulled that one out and threw it on the fire.
It's a really, really good question. And I think that, well, for starters, in terms of paintings that are linked to Chartwell, the Sutherland one certainly was for a time. After it entered Churchill's ownership, it immediately went into the boiler room at Chartwell. For anyone who's seen that, that means a room where you don't particularly want to have to look at it. I think that in terms of why that one struck such a negative chord with Winston Churchill, well, for starters, he went into that sitting saying, which one of these two versions of me do you want? Do you want the Cherub or do you want the Bulldog? And I think the fact that Sutherland went for literally what he saw in that moment, which, of course, was someone in their declining years. And because Churchill understood the power of portraiture, he didn't want that to be the immortalized image that people associated with him forevermore, someone in declining health and in their latter years. And I think, in a way, there is a strength to the Sutherland portrait, but it's not the strength that Churchill wanted to convey. It's someone who is entering their 80s, whereas Churchill wanted people to always think of him as the Bulldog. That was, in terms of him having control of his image, he wanted the wartime leader to be what you thought of him. So I think, in my mind, the Sutherland Commission, Sutherland really just, I use the phrase, didn't read the room. If you're giving someone a painting for their 80th birthday, you try and be a bit kind, don't you, I suppose? So in my opinion, that's why it met its fiery end, whereas other portraits of Churchill he appreciated much more.
Please join me. Oh, yes, one more question.
Not so much a question as a comment. First of all, if that image looks familiar, that was the cover of Finest Hour at the end of last year. So you can read more about that composition. But you can also read more about what Katherine has to say of the portrait by Sir John Lavery in the summer issue of Finest Hour that you should have received by now.
I've got my copy.
Just a plug for Katherine. There's more to read about that portrait. And there are several other portraits here that have appeared on the cover of Finest Hour.
Thank you very much, David.
Would you all please join me in thanking Katherine Carter?
All right, thank you so much, Katherine. That was really enjoyable. So please enjoy the break and return promptly at 2:15. Please know that this is the last break of the day. Thank you.